Who the fuck are you?
I'm an angel. See the wings?
It is our pleasure to introduce Keanu Reeves!
It's been a long time. I'd like a tasting.
I am quite excited to show you something. First.
Senor Wick.
Ciao, Angelo.
Welcome back to Rome.
They had an early version of bullet time.
Yeah.
It was like a bullet through the... Yeah.
At the time, it didn't look revolutionary. It looked risky, confusing, even career-threatening. The script was dense, the concepts were abstract, the language felt unfamiliar, almost academic. Executives didn't know how to market it, critics didn't know how to classify it, and many believed audiences wouldn't understand it at all. To some, it felt like a trap. The warnings came quietly, but consistently. This project could stall momentum. It could alienate mainstream viewers. It could lock an actor into a genre that rarely recovers from failure. Science fiction, after all, had a history of ambition collapsing under its own weight. And yet, something about the story refused to be ignored. Beneath the technical jargon and surreal imagery was a question far more unsettling than lasers or slow-motion fights. What if reality itself is a system designed to keep you obedient? What if freedom isn't heroic, but disorienting, lonely, and costly? Accepting this role wasn't just about action choreography or visual effects. It was about trusting an idea that felt ahead of its time, and stepping into uncertainty without knowing how the world would respond. For Keanu Reeves, choosing The Matrix meant ignoring advice rooted in safety, and betting on a story that challenged how people think, not just what they watch. And that decision changed everything. At the moment the script landed, the industry didn't see prophecy, it saw confusion. The pages were dense with philosophy, simulated realities, and questions that refused to resolve themselves neatly. There were no familiar genre guardrails. No simple hero's journey that could be summarized in a pitch meeting. Executives struggled to explain what the film was, let alone why audiences should care. That uncertainty triggered alarms. Science fiction had burned Hollywood before, big ideas that promised innovation and delivered alienation, projects that sounded smarter than they played, films that critics dissected while audiences stayed home. To many decision-makers, this script carried all the warning signs, and so the advice began to circulate. Quietly, cautiously, from agents, peers, and industry veterans who believed they were being helpful. This wasn't the kind of role you took if you wanted stability. It wasn't the kind of film you attached your name to if you were trying to protect momentum. The warnings weren't dramatic, they were practical. The concept was too complex, the tone too cold, the risk too high. At the time, action stardom followed a predictable formula. Clear villains, clear stakes, clean victories. This project offered none of that comfort. It asked audiences to question their own perception, to distrust what they were seeing, and to accept that liberation might feel worse than captivity. That wasn't considered mainstream entertainment. The role at the center of it all was equally unconventional. The character wasn't charismatic in a traditional sense. He wasn't loud or dominant. He doubted. He hesitated. He spent much of the story confused, overwhelmed, and physically outmatched. From a career standpoint, that worried people. Playing uncertainty doesn't always read as strength, especially in an era that rewarded confidence and spectacle. The concern wasn't that the role was small, it was that it was inward, that it asked for restraint in a market addicted to excess. This is where the warning sharpened. Accepting the role meant aligning with directors who were largely unproven at that scale. It meant trusting a vision that relied on technical innovation that hadn't yet been tested. It meant believing that audiences would follow a story that didn't explain itself up front. Most importantly, it meant rejecting safer alternatives. At that point, there were other offers. Projects that promised visibility without confusion. Roles that fit established expectations. The industry logic was clear. Take the sure thing now, experiment later, if at all. Experimentation was seen as indulgence. But the hesitation wasn't just external. The script didn't flatter the reader. It challenged them. It demanded engagement rather than reassurance. It required sitting with discomfort and accepting that clarity would come slowly, if at all. That kind of storytelling forces a decision. You either trust it, or you walk away. What tipped the balance wasn't spectacle. It wasn't the promise of innovation or the appeal of groundbreaking effects. It was the idea beneath the machinery, the philosophical spine running through the narrative. The story wasn't asking whether the hero could win, it was asking whether he could wake up. That distinction mattered, because beneath the action lay a question most films avoided. If reality itself is constructed, what responsibility do you have once you see through it? Is freedom empowering or isolating? And what happens to the people who choose not to know? Those questions lingered long after the script ended. They also explained why so many people were uncomfortable with the project. Films that ask audiences to question systems tend to unsettle the systems that finance them. And stories that challenge perception are harder to control than stories that reinforce it. The warnings, then, were not just about risk. They were about disruption. Disruption of genre. Disruption of expectation. Disruption of the relationship between audience and screen. From an industry perspective, disruption is expensive. From a creative perspective, it's necessary. Accepting the role meant committing to months of preparation, unlike anything else on the table. Training that blurred the line between choreography and discipline. A performance style that demanded stillness as much as movement. A character arc that avoided triumph in favor of transformation. That kind of preparation doesn't guarantee success, it only guarantees effort. And effort without assurance is what many advisors were trying to help avoid. They weren't wrong, strictly speaking. The project could have failed. It could have been misunderstood. It could have ended up as a cult curiosity rather than a cultural shift. That uncertainty is why so many people urged caution. But caution has a cost of its own. It limits how far ideas can travel. It filters out stories that don't fit existing frameworks. And it quietly discourages artists from trusting instincts that don't come with validation attached. What made this decision different was that the instinct wasn't about ego or exposure. It wasn't about playing a character who dominated the room. It was about serving a story that asked bigger questions than most blockbusters dared to approach. Choosing it meant aligning with ambiguity, and ambiguity is dangerous in an industry built on clarity. As the decision solidified, the warnings didn't stop. They softened, they became conditional. If you do this, understand the risk. If it fails, don't be surprised. If audiences don't connect, remember you were told. That kind of advice is hard to ignore because it sounds responsible. But responsibility can sometimes mask fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being wrong. Fear of backing something before the world is ready for it. This project required stepping ahead of the audience and trusting they would eventually catch up. In that gap between creation and reception, most careers falter. But that gap is also where influence is born. Accepting the role wasn't a rejection of commercial success. It was a bet on intelligence, on the idea that audiences could engage with complexity if it was delivered with conviction rather than apology. It was a choice to believe that spectacle could coexist with philosophy, that action could carry ideas without diluting them, and that viewers were more curious than executives assumed. The closer the project moved toward production, the more fragile the decision began to feel. Roles like this don't slip away with drama. They slip away quietly, through hesitation, timing, and doubt. At several points, the outcome wasn't determined by vision, but by logistics. The studio's confidence wavered. Budgets were questioned. The scope felt ambitious for something that still couldn't be easily summarized. Meetings ended with more uncertainty than clarity. Every unresolved detail became another reason to slow things down. And slowing down is how bold projects often die. Behind the scenes, alternatives were discussed. Other actors were considered, names that felt safer on paper, easier to market, more conventional in their appeal. Not because they were better suited to the role, but because they reassured people who needed reassurance. That's how risk gets reframed. It stops being about whether something works creatively and becomes about whether it feels familiar enough to justify investment. And this story, by design, rejected familiarity. The character was written to feel displaced, out of sync with his surroundings, detached from the rhythms of ordinary life. That quality was essential to the narrative, but it also made the role harder to pitch. Studios prefer protagonists who invite identification quickly, not gradually. This one demanded patience. Patience from the audience, patience from the studio, and patience from the actor portraying him. The warnings intensified not because the role lacked potential, but because it lacked precedent. There was no reliable comparison, no recent success that proved this kind of story could land at scale. And without precedent, risk becomes abstract, harder to defend, easier to avoid. At one point, the project hovered in a state of near collapse, not canceled outright, but stalled. Scripts revised, budgets adjusted, creative conversations revisited again and again. These moments rarely make headlines, but they define outcomes. Because when momentum stalls, doubt fills the space. The doubts weren't about performance, they were about comprehension. Would audiences follow a narrative that refused to hold their hand? Would they accept a world where answers came slowly, if at all? Would they embrace a hero whose power emerged from understanding rather than dominance? Those questions unsettled decision-makers. Action films at the time offered release. This one offered disruption. That distinction explains why so many people urged stepping away. Not because they lacked faith in the talent involved, but because they didn't trust the audience. They believed viewers wanted escape, not interrogation. But this project was built on the opposite assumption. It assumed curiosity. It assumed discomfort could be engaging. It assumed that spectacle could be a vehicle for ideas rather than a distraction from them. That assumption ran counter to industry logic. The training process added another layer of uncertainty. Months of preparation went into something that couldn't yet be guaranteed. The physical discipline required was intense, but not showy. It wasn't about building mass or dominance, it was about control, precision, and restraint. This mirrored the philosophy of the film itself. Power didn't come from force, it came from awareness. That theme shaped everything, from movement to dialogue to pacing. The performance wasn't designed to overwhelm, it was designed to observe, to absorb, to react. That kind of acting doesn't announce itself. And because it doesn't announce itself, it's easy to underestimate. The final green light arrived not with confidence, but with compromise. Budgets were tightened. Expectations were managed. The film moved forward under the assumption that it might succeed modestly, or fail quietly. No one predicted what followed. Once production began in earnest, something shifted. The ambiguity that had worried executives became a strength. The lack of explanation created intrigue. The discipline of the performances grounded the abstraction. The film didn't rush to convince, it invited curiosity. That invitation mattered. Instead of overwhelming audiences with exposition, it trusted them to connect dots. Instead of offering clear answers, it let questions linger. That trust created engagement rather than confusion. Ironically, the very qualities people warned against became the reasons the film worked. The warnings had assumed audiences wanted simplicity. The film revealed they wanted meaning. As early footage circulated, skepticism softened. Not because everything suddenly made sense, but because the tone felt deliberate. The world felt coherent, even when it was unfamiliar. The confusion felt purposeful rather than careless. Purpose is what separates ambition from chaos. By the time the film neared release, the conversation had changed. The same people who urged caution began to recalibrate. Not fully convinced, but curious. And curiosity is the beginning of acceptance. What no one had fully anticipated was how deeply the story would resonate beyond entertainment. The philosophical questions weren't abstract, they were timely. Ideas about control, perception, and constructed reality found an audience already questioning the systems around them. The film didn't create that anxiety, it articulated it. That articulation is why the warnings now feel ironic in hindsight. The very risks people tried to avoid became the film's strength. The complexity that frightened executives gave the story longevity. The ambiguity that worried marketers invited repeated viewing. And the role that seemed too inward became iconic precisely because it resisted spectacle. This is the lesson the industry often learns too late. Safe choices may protect careers in the short term, but they rarely define eras. Defining eras requires trusting stories that don't arrive with guarantees. Stories that ask questions instead of delivering answers. Stories that risk alienation in pursuit of resonance. The warnings weren't malicious. They were reasonable within a system designed to minimize uncertainty. But reasonableness is not how cultural shifts happen. They happen when someone ignores reasonable advice in favor of intuition, especially when that intuition points toward discomfort rather than security. The decision to take this role wasn't about proving something. It was about aligning with an idea that felt unfinished, unresolved, and necessary. That alignment gave the performance its quiet authority. When the film finally reached audiences, the reaction didn't explode instantly. It unfolded. Slowly. Almost cautiously. Viewers didn't walk out cheering. They walked out thinking. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. This wasn't a movie people consumed and moved on from. It lingered. Conversations continued days later. Scenes replayed in people's minds. Questions followed them home. That kind of response doesn't show up in opening weekend projections, but it defines cultural endurance. The same ambiguity that executives feared became the film's gravitational pull. Audiences weren't confused. They were curious. They recognized something familiar beneath the science fiction surface. A sense of unease about systems they couldn't see but felt every day. Work. Media. Authority. Routine. The quiet suspicion that choice was more limited than advertised. The film didn't invent that feeling. It gave it language. And at the center of that language was a performance built on restraint rather than dominance. The character didn't lecture. He didn't posture. He observed. He questioned. He learned. Power emerged gradually, almost reluctantly. That arc contradicted everything the warnings had assumed. The role didn't weaken a career, it reframed what strength could look like on screen. Strength became awareness. Control became clarity. Confidence came not from certainty, but from adaptation. This reframing rippled outward. Action cinema had long relied on escalation. Bigger explosions, louder villains, clear victories. This film disrupted that formula by making the internal journey as important as the external conflict. It suggested that transformation, not triumph, could carry a blockbuster. The industry noticed, quietly at first. Studios didn't immediately change course, but creatives paid attention. Writers saw that philosophical ideas could live inside mainstream entertainment without alienating audiences. Directors saw that style could serve theme rather than overwhelm it. Actors saw that understatement could be as powerful as spectacle. And the warnings that once sounded practical began to sound outdated. What had been framed as too complex was now praised as layered. What had been called too risky was now considered visionary. What had been dismissed as unmarketable became iconic. This reversal didn't just validate one decision, it challenged an entire mindset. It exposed how often industries mistake familiarity for accessibility, how frequently they underestimate audiences, and how easily caution can masquerade as wisdom. For Keanu Reeves, the outcome wasn't just success, it was redefinition. The role reshaped how he was perceived, not as a conventional action lead, but as a conduit for ideas. Someone whose presence grounded abstraction rather than overshadowing it. That distinction created longevity. Instead of being tied to a single moment, the performance became a reference point. Not because it demanded attention, but because it rewarded it. Viewers returned to the film at different stages of life and found new meanings waiting. That kind of endurance can't be engineered. It emerges when a story aligns with questions people haven't fully articulated yet. The early warnings failed because they measured risk using outdated tools. They assessed marketability without considering relevance. They focused on short-term reception rather than long-term resonance. The film didn't succeed despite its complexity. It succeeded because of it. And that success changed how science fiction was treated. The genre gained permission to be introspective again, to ask philosophical questions without apology, to trust audiences with ambiguity. It also changed how studios evaluated unusual scripts. Not overnight, but gradually. The threshold for what was considered acceptable risk shifted. That shift is why the decision still matters today. It stands as proof that some stories cannot be validated in advance. They require commitment before consensus. They require someone to step forward when certainty doesn't exist yet. The warnings were rooted in logic. The choice was rooted in intuition. Both have their place. But progress rarely comes from logic alone. Looking back, it's easy to frame the decision as obvious. History has a way of flattening uncertainty. But at the moment of choice, nothing was guaranteed. The risks were real. The doubts were reasonable. That's what makes the outcome instructive. It reminds us that creative breakthroughs often look irresponsible before they look inevitable. That ideas ahead of their time are often mistaken for ideas that don't belong at all. And that listening to every warning can sometimes prevent the very thing that moves culture forward. The film didn't just validate a career choice. It validated a belief that audiences are capable of engaging with complexity when it's delivered with sincerity. That spectacle doesn't need to replace meaning. And that discomfort can be more memorable than reassurance. Those lessons continue to echo. Every time a filmmaker pushes against convention, every time a script refuses to explain itself immediately, every time a performance chooses restraint over exaggeration, the warnings were never about failure. They were about fear of the unknown. And the unknown, when approached with intention, is where the most enduring stories come from. In hindsight, the advice to walk away reads like a snapshot of an industry unsure of itself, hesitant to trust ideas that couldn't be neatly categorized. The decision to move forward reads like something else entirely. A quiet act of faith. Not in guaranteed success, but in the intelligence of the audience, the power of ideas, and the value of stories that don't arrive with instructions. That faith didn't just pay off, it changed the rules. With enough distance, the early warnings no longer sound like wisdom. They sound like a record of how often progress is misunderstood before it's recognized. The advice to walk away wasn't rooted in malice or ignorance. It was rooted in precedent. In an industry trained to repeat what already works, anything that refuses to resemble the past feels dangerous. That's why this decision still matters. The project didn't succeed by reassuring audiences. It succeeded by trusting them. It assumed curiosity instead of confusion, patience instead of passivity. And that assumption reshaped not just a film, but a genre. What ultimately silenced the warnings wasn't box office alone, it was longevity. The way the story continued to surface in conversations years later. The way it adapted to new cultural anxieties without losing relevance. The way its questions felt less like fiction and more like preparation. That endurance is the clearest rebuttal to every caution raised at the beginning. The role itself became a case study in restraint. Strength was conveyed without bravado. Authority emerged without domination. The character's power wasn't about defeating enemies. It was about understanding the system that produced them. That approach redefined what an action protagonist could represent. Hollywood took note. Slowly, the industry adjusted its expectations. Not by abandoning spectacle, but by reintroducing substance. Films became more willing to embed ideas within entertainment. Sci-fi regained permission to be philosophical without apologizing for it. And audiences proved they were more receptive than executives had assumed. The warnings failed because they treated complexity as a liability. In reality, complexity was the invitation. It encouraged repeat viewing, debate, interpretation, ownership. Viewers didn't just consume the film, they engaged with it. They argued about it. They carried it forward. That kind of engagement can't be manufactured through marketing. It has to be earned through trust. For Keanu Reeves, the outcome was not just a career milestone, but a recalibration of what his presence signified on screen. He became associated with stories that asked questions rather than delivered slogans, with characters who learned rather than imposed, with worlds that challenged perception instead of reinforcing comfort. That association is rare and durable. Looking back, it's tempting to frame the choice as inevitable. But inevitability is a luxury of hindsight. At the time, there were no guarantees, only instincts, risks, and the willingness to accept uncertainty. And that's the real lesson embedded in this story, not that ignoring advice is heroic, But that advice rooted in fear rarely produces anything transformative. Cultural shifts require someone to move before consensus exists. They require faith in ideas that don't yet have metrics. They require trust in audiences before proof arrives. This decision worked because it aligned with a deeper truth. People are more willing to engage with difficult ideas than institutions often believe. They want stories that respect their intelligence, challenge their assumptions, and reflect their unease. The film didn't just reflect the moment it was released into, it anticipated the ones that followed. That anticipation is why the warnings now feel irrelevant. They were based on what had already happened, not on what was emerging. They measured risk using yesterday's standards. The success of this project updated those standards. It reminded Hollywood that innovation often looks like confusion before it looks like clarity. That originality rarely announces itself as safe. And that sometimes the most responsible creative decision is the one that feels least certain. The legacy of this choice isn't just a successful franchise or a genre milestone. It's proof that mainstream cinema can carry ideas without losing its audience. That action can coexist with philosophy. And that trusting complexity can expand, rather than limit, reach. That's why this story continues to resonate. Because it isn't really about a warning that was ignored. It's about a system that underestimated curiosity, and a decision that proved curiosity was always there, waiting for the right story to invite it. If this story changed how you think about creative risk, career-defining decisions, and why some warnings should be questioned, not obeyed, stay with the channel. Here, we explore the unseen turning points behind iconic films, performances, and choices that reshaped Hollywood by refusing to play it safe. Subscribe for more deep documentary-style breakdowns of legendary roles and the hidden decisions that changed cinema. And if there's another film or actor whose wrong choice turned out to be history-making, tell us in the comments. Because the most important moments in film often begin with someone being told, "Don't do it."